comes out, and then your brain stem comes down and forms spinal cord. I will make this point. In the average adult, the spinal cord ends at about L2, the second lumbar vertebrae. It does not go all the way down to the sacrum. Okay, which for those of us in anesthesia is advantageous. For, if I wanted to, well, let's say if Cassandra were here and she was getting ready to have a baby and I wanted to numb her, say, somewhere around T10 down so that labor wasn't so painful, I would do what is known as an epidural. Have you ever had one?
No, I've never had an epidural.
Well, no, I've had two.
Oh, I see.
For problems with your lower back.
No, I've never had an epidural.
All right. Well, what an
I thought it was actually just for women only.
No, sir. I've had two of them because it deadens or anesthetizes spinal nerves. Okay? But the epidural, when we put them in, generally, well, depending upon the woman and their anatomy, but we try to go between L3, L4, and L4 and L5. And you say, well, why do you do that? Well, because the average person, the spinal cord ends at about L2, so when we go down there, if we should happen to go a little bit too far and actually end up in the spinal canal, we won't do a spinal cord biopsy because it's not there. Now, they're going to get a hell of a headache after that, but because the needle, if you've ever seen a 16-gauge TUI needle that's used to do an epidural, it's big. Has a little cup on the end of it. But anyway, all right, so remember this. In the average adult, spinal cord ends about L2. The spinal canal continues all the way down to the sacrum. But there's no cord in there. But what is in there is spinal fluid. Okay? The spinal canal, covered by these membranes and meninges, houses, well, the spinal cord until you get to about here and around the brain, and down in it houses the spinal fluid. Spinal fluid serves as an additional protective mechanism for the spinal cord as a shock absorber. Water, which is mostly what spinal fluid is, if you know from physics or anything, it's very hard to compress. Okay, so like if I were to put pressure on it, it wouldn't be transmitted inward because it doesn't compress. It absorbs the energy without being compressed and transferring the energy inward, which is good for our brain, which is good for our spinal cord. Okay? All right. So I'm just trying to hit on the high points that I really want you to kind of take in. Know how many of these you have. Know how many ribs you have. And I've been reminded recently. Normal humans, they have 12 pairs of ribs. Okay? Contrary to popular belief where, well, don't men have one less rib than women because the woman was made from the rib of a man? No, sorry. We have the first 7 pair are called true ribs. First 7. And why do they call them that? Well, because they attach directly to your sternum by way of cartilage. Okay? People do CPR, right? Boom, 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 boom. And what are they pressing on when they do CPR?
I guess the sternum.
The sternum. And so well, sometimes they do, but hopefully by and large, when you press down on the sternum, it gives a little bit so that you can put pressure on the heart, on the left ventricle to move blood. And the reason that you're able to do that is that these ribs, here's your sternum, and you got this little manubrium at the end. The first 7 pair attach directly to the sternum by way of this cartilage called costal cartilage. Okay, so they attach directly, so they're called true ribs. The last 5 pair are called false ribs because they do not attach directly to the sternum by way of cartilage. They attach to actually the cartilage of the 7th rib. All of these come, they sort of come together and attach to the 7th rib by way of this cartilage. And let me find a picture for you, so because pictures kind of make it, kind of solidify it. Look on page 203, figure 7.1. Okay?
Okay.
All right, now you look at the 7th rib. You see that?
7.1 or 7.0?
The 7th rib.
Oh,
right there.
but okay, 7.2,
7.21, yeah.
Okay.
So if you look at the 7th rib, it attaches directly to the sternum by way of cartilage, right? Mm-hmm. Now if you look at 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, well, 11 and 12 are special cases, we'll talk about them in a minute, but 8, 9, and 10, they attach to the cartilage indirectly by way of the 7th rib. So they call them false ribs. Okay? Now also remember that these 7 true ribs and these 5 false ribs articulate. Good word to know. Let's write that word down. Articulate means...
Now, is that the first 7 pair or the last 5? There were 2. How many articulate?
Well, hold on. Let me just tell you first what articulate means.
Move.
Forms a joint.
Okay.
Okay. The first 7 and the subsequent 5, the first 7, they form a joint with the sternum by way of cartilage, but they also articulate posteriorly to the spinal column. The subsequent 5, the false ribs, they articulate with the cartilage of the 7th rib, and you can see that there. You can see how they kind of do that. But they also articulate posteriorly to the spinal column. All right? Now, the last 2 ribs, number 11 and number 12, do you notice anything kind of unique about them?
Well, 12 doesn't have any white.
Right, so it does not form any anterior up front articulation, but it does form posterior articulations. All right, so they call those 2 ribs, and they're included in the 5, but the last 2 are called floating ribs. Okay, and what that means is, and you can see that they have no anterior articulation, right? So they kind of just float there. I broke my ribs right there and right there.
What, 8 and 9?
8 and 9. Okay, so the floating ribs, what to remember is no anterior articulation. Okay, all of them articulate posteriorly, and that is to the spinal column. All right. And then again, if you look on that same page, this is page 203, figure 7.2.1, you'll see a diagram of the sacrum, and you can see the S1 through S5 all fused into one sacrum. And then here, this one here shows 1, 2, 3, 4 coccygeal. Now, the sacral ones are S1 through S5. But the coccygeal are CO1 through CO, we'll say 4. Okay, because you can't use C twice, because C is used for cervical. So the coccygeal, they denote those CO. All right. And I should have brought that up before we went into the other, but just in the naming and the numbering of the vertebrae, kind of look at that. The naming and the numbering, or the number of ribs that human have, 12 pairs, 7 true ribs, 5 false ribs, and the last 2 false ribs are called floaters because they have no anterior articulation. Okay. And we're getting kind of on, so I want to move on to muscle. But go through the bones, and what I would ask you to do is just, you're not going to memorize them, there's no point. The major players, you know, this is my humerus, the bones of the forearm. The radius is always going to be on the thumb side. The ulna is going to be opposite that. Okay, just the major bones. Okay, we're not going to break down every single bone of the skull, but do know and do keep in mind that there are 3 little bones on either side of your head that are in your middle ear. They're often overlooked, and they are called the ossicles, your ear ossicles. Okay, they are the malleus, the so-called hammer, the incus, I-N-C-U-S, the so-called anvil that the hammer hits on, and the third one is the stapes, the so-called, or stirrups. So remember, you have 3 of those in each ear, each middle ear. Okay, these are the middle ear ossicles. All right. Hammer, anvil, and stirrups. The hammer strikes the anvil moves the stirrups move the oval window. When sound is transmitted, do you know what sound is?
No.
Okay. It's just a simple compression and rarefaction of air molecules. Okay? When we produce sound, we force air through our vocal cords, comes out our mouth, and it affects the air around us, causing air molecules to compress and then expand. Rarefaction, compression, rarefaction. All of that, compression, rarefaction around us is directed down into our ear canal. All right, and then when it gets there, it strikes a membrane called the eardrum. And what that eardrum does is it vibrates. Connected to the eardrum, and all that's on the outer ear. Then we move to the middle ear. Connected to the eardrum membrane is the hammer, the malleus. So when the eardrum vibrates, the hammer vibrates. When it vibrates, it causes the incus to vibrate. When it vibrates, it causes the stapes to vibrate. And normally the middle ear is air filled. So there's nothing to dampen the vibrations. And we hear distinctly or hear clearly. When the stapes vibrates, it's connected to another membrane called the oval window, and that separates the middle ear from the inner ear, and when it does that, it sets up a vibration, a fluid vibration. And we'll get into that more when we talk about the senses. But anyway, ear infections can be damaging to children, because if that middle ear, which is normally air filled, if bacteria get up in there, which they do frequently, and I'll tell you why in 1 second, they multiply and they metabolize and they produce pus and fluid. Well, then the fluid starts to collect in that middle ear and it dampens those vibrations. And it can be detrimental to children because if children don't hear clearly, they don't develop clear speech pattern. Okay? All right, what did I want to say about that? That ear canal, I'll make a note of that too because you may see it. That hole in our head, in the temporal bone, it's in the temporal bone, is called the external auditory, referring to sound, meatus. It's a hole in our temporal bone where our ear canal lies. All right? That's an important structure there. All right. So when I say, and I sort of made reference to this earlier, when we look at our entire skeleton and we look at our bones, first, don't think of them as these dense solid objects. They're dynamic, they're rather porous, they have a good blood supply and nerve supply to at least to the periosteum. And like if you look at the next, on page 208, okay? We'll keep going just a bit.
Right, I see it.
And I want to bring up one point, and then I got to talk about one thing about muscles, at least. All right, look at the difference. Okay, here is the human
Figure
pelvis.
7.28.
Figure 7.28. What you see there is the adjoining of three different bones. The ilium, which is the part that makes up, the top part of our hip, the ischium, and then the pubis. The ischium is actually what we sit on most of the time. And then you'll see a big hole in there. It's called the obturer foramen. Again, we see that term foramen, meaning a hole. And what passes through there is probably, you've had a lot of experience with what passes through there, is your sciatic nerve. You ever had any problem with sciatic nerve?
Believe it or not, no.
Okay. Well, why did they work on your back?
It was spondylolisthesis.
Spondylolisthesis.
Yeah, spondylolisthesis,
Okay.
exactly.
All right. So I got the same thing. All right. So you're going to just go through the bones. Look at the major players. Don't try to memorize all of them. Know what a suture is and know that it is a joint, but it is not movable. You have, I guess I should say that too, 3 types of joints basically, since we're talking about bone. Let's do that, and then I just want to bring up sliding filament, but joints. We have 3 basic types. We have one that is called diarthrotic. And by and large, what that means is that if my memory serves, that is freely movable. In other words, I'm able to take my arm and perform this kind of movement because I've got a lot of free movement in these diarthrotic joints. We have synarthrotic, and I have to confess, and what the third one is, but I don't even know if your text brings it up, but it may. Is, yes, synarthrotic is, partially movable, and then you have one that's called amphiarthrotic. Oh, I think I got these backwards. Synarthrotic is immovable. amphiarthrotic is partially movable. And when I say the synarthrotic is like the bones of your skull and the bones of your hips, okay? And while we're on that, investigate, just take a quick look at a synovial joint. All right, and an example would be your shoulder joint and your knee joint, because that's a special type of joint on page 213. Does it tell us?
7.35?
Yes, and 7.36.
Okay.
Because these types of joints, these synovial joints, the membranes that are in there secrete a fluid called synovial fluid that kind of greases up the joints and helps them to move freely. Okay, like especially for me nowadays, as we get older and we get arthrotic. I don't know about you, but when I get up in the morning, it's a little bit of a rough go until I start moving around and get greased up, if you will. And it's because the movement, kind of stimulates production of this fluid inside these joints, and then and now it's a little easier after a cup of coffee, and whatever. But just look at the synovial joint so that differentiate it from the other types of joints, these cartilaginous joints and these fibrous joints. Generally, no appreciable movement, synarthrotic. Yeah, that's right. Okay, and then you have these cartilaginous joints, annulus fibrosis, not nucleus fibrosis. Anyway, my bad. These cartilaginous type joints are like the joints that are between our vertebrae. Okay, the synovial joints, the diarthrotic are where we have a lot of free movement. Okay, and that grease helps. Synarthrotic, by and large, they're not movable. You're not going to move them. Okay? All right. And just take a look at, don't spend a lot of time on the joints. Just know, you have a ball and socket joint, and there's basically only two, right? Your hips and your arms. You have a hinge joint, your knees and your elbows. You have a pivot joint like on where axis and atlas meet that allow you to just say no. And a condylar joint and a planar joint. I'm not going to go into those real big. Okay, know about a ball and socket and know about a synovial, and that's good enough. These names, they don't use them. I don't think they even use amphiarthrotic, but all right. It's a boatload of information here. Okay, I would notice this when you see on page 216, types of movement. You're probably familiar with most of them here.
Okay. Figure 7.38.
And the one on the ensuing page, 7.40. Okay. All right, and just real quick, what they mean. Flexion means to decrease the angle between a joint. Oh, and by the way, we have 206 bones in our body. All but one are jointed somehow by one of these three methods. The only one that isn't jointed is a bone in your neck called your hyoid bone, and actually your tongue attaches to that. But anyway, all right, we have flexion, decrease in angle between a joint. We have extension, increase in angle between a joint. Okay. Abduction is this. If you abduct something, what do? You take it away from where it belongs, right? So abduction is to move away from the midline. Adduction is to move toward the midline. So if you're doing jumping jacks, you're doing a series of abduction and adduction. Okay?
And they have machines at the
Sure.
Y that do an adduction and an abduction.
Abduction and adduction
Yeah.
machines, and because all of your muscles, if you want to work out specific muscles, they all have a primary movement that they undertake. Like to build up your pecs. A lot of the kids out there, they think, well, the best exercise to build your pecs is a push-up. When you do a push-up, you're more working your triceps than you are your pec muscles. You want to work your pecs, you put weights in on either hand, and you adduct the weight toward the midline of the body. And that is the prime movement of your pectoral muscles, but that's a whole different story. All right, circumduction. So we have adduction, we have abduction, and then we have circumduction, going around in a movement. Important ones is this, and I made reference to this a while ago. Pronation is lying, prone, or in the case of your upper extremities is when the palms are backward. Supination is when the palms are forward. Pronation, supination. Okay. Abduction, adduction, circumduction. All right. What else? Inversion. If you're looking at your feet, inversion, you move them in. Eversion, you move them out. All right. Just kind of look through those movements. You won't have any trouble with those. Okay, elevation is like this. Depression, like that. The opposite. Okay, and you'll see they come in pairs. All right, so much for that. Let me do this because I got to go at 9. Well, hell, we got to go in 5 minutes. All right, look through the bones. Just kind of become familiar with that. What I want you to do, and that's part of the exercise that you're going to do for your discussion, is muscle contraction. Okay? Muscle contraction is carried out by this so-called sliding filament theory, or sliding filament mechanism, or sliding filament hypothesis, whatever you want to call it, whatever they're calling it now. It was called a theory back when I was first studying this stuff, and it then was called a mechanism, now it's a hypothesis. But what it means is, muscles do only one thing. Or actually, I'm sorry, they do two things. They contract and they relax. All right? They only pull. They do not push. Okay? And muscles contract by this so-called sliding filament, and I'll call it a mechanism because that's what it is. And you have two types of muscle protein, primary types, and they are called actin, the so-called thin filament, and myosin, the so-called thick filament. And when a muscle contracts or when a muscle shortens, these thick and these thin filaments slide past each other. And the basic unit of contraction is called a sarcomere, and it just shortens by these two protein myofilaments sliding past one another. If you, okay, where are you? If
And this will be page 229.
look on page 231,
Okay.
figure 8.6,
Okay.
and I'll draw your attention. You see the thick filament here, okay? And then you'll see the thin filament above it. And attached to that thin filament are two regulatory proteins, and they're called troponin and tropomyosin. Tropomyosin. And what they do is they regulate whether or not this thick filament can form attachments to the thin filament and pull it in toward the center of the sarcomere. All right? So in other words, what happens here? You see these little cross bridges of these myosin heads? When these regulatory proteins, these troponin and these tropomyosin, when calcium binds to them, they change shape. And they actually...
Okay, that's figure 8.6.
That's figure 8.6. Look at that. In fact, what I would ask you to do, important, is to look at I guess if you look at figure 8.7, it goes through this step by step. Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5, step 6. And it identifies the proteins involved, you know, the actin and the myosin. It identifies the regulatory proteins, troponin and tropomyosin. It identifies the calcium ions, why they're important, and it also identifies the role of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. You know, and you probably don't remember it, but if you do, this is the energy currency of our bodies. This is the molecule that our bodies use to conduct biological activity. ATP. And so if you go through it just once or twice, it'll kind of make sense to you. There's a very important neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. All right? This is a neurotransmitter that provides for muscle contraction. All right. When we want to move, our frontal cortex will send electrical impulses from our brain, down our spinal cord, out to the motor nerves in our bodies, to our muscles. Muscle contraction is an electro first, then chemical event. Electrochemical. The electro part comes from an impulse from the brain. The chemical part comes from this neurotransmitter called acetylcholine, or you'll see it sometimes written ACH. All right? When that nervous impulse comes from our brain, out our motor neurons, and it reaches the end bulbs of the motor neurons, they release this acetylcholine. It diffuses across a small area called a synaptic cleft, and it will bind to receptors on the muscle cell. That will cause the muscle cell to depolarize. Yeah, you should know that term. Look up that term. Depolarize. And that's actually a misnomer. It should be a reversal. And repolarize. I think she's coming to kick us out, right? Are you kicking us out? Okay. Just look up those terms. Okay. Look up acetylcholine and its role. Go through this 2 or 3 times right here.
Okay, page 232.
Yes.
Okay.
And pay
And that's
particular attention.
Figure 8.7.
All right. And you see this sarcomere here, right?
Okay, that would be figure 8.8.
Yes. That is the functional unit of contraction. And there are hundreds of these sarcomeres.